Welcome, everyone. We are so glad you can be with us. Many of you have been attending the shelter support and leadership calls that we host on Mondays and Fridays. Our recent guest was Justin Marceau, an Animal Legal Defense Fund professor and Brooks Institute faculty research scholar at the University of Denver. Justin is also the author of Beyond Cages, Animal Law and Criminal Punishment, about how current law enforcement models can produce unintended consequences for families and their pets. There was so much to uncover, and we wanted to give you an opportunity to learn more and get your questions answered. Joining Justin is Gabrielle Chapman, a social justice analyst and consultant who formerly worked with the HSUS Pets for Life program. She is amazing. Welcome, Gabrielle and Justin.
Thanks so much, Lisa. I'm really excited today to introduce this topic and sort of continue the conversation that we had a few weeks ago. I just wanted to start out by saying Justin Marceau's work has been so powerful to me because it lent a voice and really some reason around some of the things I've experienced as a person of color. I got started on my journey as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice probably in 2012. And then in 2013, I was introduced to Michelle Alexander's work, The New Jim Crow. And I encourage anyone that is wanting to learn more about the topic I dig into today. The New Jim Crow is a really great starting point. And the piece that I wanted to really lift up was Justin Marceau, to me, is to animal welfare what Michelle Alexander was to and is to the criminal justice reform movement. So I think his work is just groundbreaking, and it's putting some wheels onto a topic that really we need to be talking about. And before we get started, I just wanted to sort of have some housekeeping and introduction kind of stuff. I just first want to acknowledge that this topic is very large and we only have 45 minutes. So there's no way that we're going to be able to get into everything. But some of the goals that I have outlined for this talk are just sort of getting a baseline understanding of what equity and animal welfare could look like. And then also sort of leading us through a conversation that shows us some of the parallels from the past and what we can learn from history. And then lastly, I want us to sort of start talking a little bit about, as we learn from the past, what can we do to inform our community-led and community-centric sheltering models. The other kind of housekeeping topics I wanted to mention would be, we're monitoring the chat. So please put in questions into the chat. And as we go, as I see questions, I'll try to bring those up. And I just also want to acknowledge that everyone is in a different place when it comes to their DEI or social justice journey. So it's pretty normal if you leave with more questions than you showed up with. And sometimes you might leave with not having closure. So that's perfectly normal. And the one thing I wanted to also mention is after we have this talk, we would like to continue the conversation on the Maddie's Forum. So please, if you haven't already registered, sign up for the Maddie's Pet Forum, and we'll be in there monitoring and chatting back and forth. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing I wanted to mention is there's this emerging theme, not just in animal welfare, but across the country around undoing harm and this idea of mitigation of harm. And within animal welfare, I think there's this growing understanding that a lot of the things that we face as service providers or shelter leaders, we're realizing that it's coming out of a cycle of poverty. And a lot of the things we notice within the criminal justice system and things that have been punished in the past is related to humans and animals not having their basic needs met. So not having their basic Maslow hierarchy of needs. And just to kind of prime us for the questions I have for Justin, historically, there's been this old logic that we've sort of just always went with. And the logic is more punishment equals better outcomes. And I just wanted to offer up a couple different historical contexts, one being the war on drugs. This comes out of the Nixon administration, but there was this public campaign of Just Say No, and there was this history behind the Just Say No campaign, but I won't get into all of it. But what we learned was we weren't able to necessarily police away substance abuse disorder or criminality around poverty. And another example is current opioid epidemic and homelessness. There's this old logic that we're able to police away these societal problems. Again, that old logic, if we punish people, we will be able to mitigate those things from happening. So what we're recognizing from a public health perspective is that actually is not necessarily the case, right? And what I want to offer up today in this first segment is invite group to consider the new logic and the alternative ways of thinking that builds upon what we've learned from in the past. So the new logic being, if we care about companion animals and their outcomes, maybe we need to consider how the logic of disinvestment maybe in policing. So rather than city and state governments investing in more militarized weapons, maybe thinking about investing into like wraparound services like social work or clinical psychology to actually dig into the systemic reasons why animals end up in shelters in the first place. So yeah, moving away from punishment and these punitive measures and moving into a position of support. So the first question I have for you, Justin, is can you outline some of the patterns of transformation inside the criminal justice system that have led to increased prevention?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting, and it's an honor to be here with Gabrielle and with all of you. I'll just say it's a surprisingly difficult question to think about patterns of transformation in the criminal justice system. And it's something we could talk about for a long time. I think what we know now is that there are sort of changes, there are waves of reform that come in vogue and then lose traction. And what happens over time, actually, although for persons watching it from the outside, it may seem like there's some sort of radical shift afoot, right? We've talked about the George Floyd trial, and we see all of these things happening, but they're really quite cosmetic or superficial. And the transformations that are happening are really minor. And what I mean by that is to understand when we're talking about social change and social reform on a bigger picture, animal law, of course, being part of that picture, the thing to remember, and what sociologists and legal scholars have pointed out for decades, is that the folks that are making money and the people that are invested in the existing system will always find ways to make it look palatable to the public. And so what happens, and the transformations that I'm seeing at this moment are transformations that, a group might say, we're against locking up children under 16 with adults. We're against juvenile incarceration with adults. And then they tout that as an important policy reform. But this is the sort of thing that scholars for a long time have documented as the kind of tweaking of the grotesque flourishes. So I don't see really radical changes happening. What's going to have to happen is people on the ground, like you all, are going to have to show, like, look, we care. We want to try something different. We don't see numbers in animal neglect or abuse going down, and we want to do something different. And then that drives top-down change from the big organizations. And if I could, just for 20 seconds, I don't know, you tell me, Gabrielle, if I'm talking too long, but I often get asked two questions that are sort of on this topic by people when I'm speaking. One of them is, Justin, how did mass incarceration happen? And the other, and this is from animal lawyers and animal advocates, and the other is, well, do you really think that, animal prosecutions have anything to do with it? Because it's not like the prisons are filled with animal abusers or animal neglectors, right? And what's interesting is that it's rarely the same person that asks those two questions, but they usually come in the same segment. And I think these two questions are remarkably linked in ways that we don't think about it, right? Because there was no single event, no single transformation that brought us to or triggered mass incarceration. That's a myth, right? It was a gradual process that was built over time through rhetorics and discourses and practices. And in the animal movement, it's not that we have a lion's share of the prisoners, right? Although if you look at the national data for prosecutions and arrests for animal crime, it's not trivial. It's not that we're putting most people in prison. Rather, it's the way we talk about the system, right? For example, when we talk about the link, we talk about, to quote one really famous advocate in this movement, budding psychopaths. We talk about, quote, ticking time bombs. We talk about this in this sort of language that is reminiscent of super predators and that kind of thing. And I'll tell you what, more than anything else, it's this discourse. It's these emails that say, look at this guy who got a slap on a wrist. Look at this person. Bumper stickers that say, abuse an animal, go to jail. It's that type of thing that brought us mass incarceration, right? And so to combat it, we have to imagine kind of dismantling those conversations. And so I don't know if that's responsive.
That's excellent. Thank you so much. I might go off the cuff a little bit, and I have a follow-up question.
Great.
So I was reading your book, and a couple things come up, a lot of things come up actually, but pertinent to this conversation, I think a lot about these overlaps with the war on drugs. And I think a lot about the Willie Horton narrative and like this idea of fear mongering. And in your book, you mentioned that there's been this historical strategy from animal welfare movements to sort of use this tactic for fundraising. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, I mean, so, just as political candidates, as you said, have made it known that a man named William Horton was suddenly called Willie Horton, and images of his non-white, release on parole were sort of put out to political ends. Animal groups are political beasts too, right? They aren't running for office, but they are trying to prove sort of political ground. They're trying to make themselves known in the legislature, and they use very similar strategies, which is taking a bad act and blowing it up, and then sending out emails and doing events around this, sort of sensationalized. It's the same sort of moral panic, right? Are we convinced that this undocumented person is going to go and kill persons because they weren't legally crossing the border? Are we convinced that this person who was released on parole is going to be dangerous to us, right? And just in the last week, it's striking, right? I don't know if you've seen this, but there's been emails in the last week that I've received from different groups. One of them railing against parole. A man spent 10 years in prison and then was paroled, and the email explained how this was a great travesty of justice. In another email just this week asking for donations, an African-American man in South Carolina was sentenced to 10 years in prison. And we were told in the email that this was made possible only because of the donations and the support for combating crime, right? It said, if you want to have appropriate sentences like this. And when I pulled up the case, it's interesting because the animal group celebrated the fact that this man was sentenced to 10 years as a reason, as a sign of victory that we should donate to. And this was last week, but this was in 1996. In citing the reason that we should celebrate this victory, these sort of cited this case. I pulled up the case. The guy was actually sentenced to 98 years. 10 years incarcerated and 108 years, 98 years suspended and 10 years incarcerated. So those of you who work in the system know what that means, right? The movement said, we got 10 years imprisonment for this guy. Well, he's going to get out of prison in 10 years, and then he's going to have a 98-year sentence hanging over his head if he violates any terms of parole or probation. And so, right, I've worked on cases where the woman was incarcerated for a violation of not notifying her address change when she had a rat infestation, right? So this is cause for celebration, a 108-year sentence with 98 of the years suspended. That was just this week.
So I want to ask one more question along these lines. So there's been this national push from big tent organizations to move from punitive punishment, so felonies, things of that nature. I think there's actually been this new national passing of federal law. But I want to also dig into a little bit of what I think maybe your next book might talk about some. But there's been this shift of moving from criminal to civil penalties. Can you talk a little bit about how that might show up and how that may be problematic for people of color?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, there's a lot of work being done to repackage the narrative. And I guess it's related to my first answer, and I appreciate you raising it, Gabrielle, is that there's there's this sort of shifting of the narrative because we're in a political moment where we're all part of it. And there's these questions about enforcement and state enforcement, fines, fees, incarceration that were not on the radar 5 years ago for many people. Some of us were looking at them, but many people were not. So now that this is in the headlines, you see a lot of pivoting. And the pivoting is, oh, well, we're not actually seeking incarceration in this case, right? And so somebody actually wrote an article recently that said, most of our interventions are non-carceral. What they meant by that was that they recommend probation and fines and fees slightly more than incarceration. But for marginalized communities, right, the reality is that in most states, the numbers of persons who are incarcerated in jails and prisons for probation violations or for the failure to pay those fines exceeds half of the population of incarcerated persons, right? So we're talking huge numbers here. In other places, it's a quarter of the population. So, the shift, I think it's admirable to be having a conversation where we say, sometimes incarceration doesn't actually help animals. Sometimes it doesn't reduce the amount of neglect in our communities or abuse. But we have to be mindful that if we just lock in other approaches that say, okay, we need to find the bad person, we need to blame that person, and we'll just fine them, right? Those fines can be just as hard, and they can result in all the same things as jailing, immigration consequences, and so on.
I found this, I was doing some research online, just Googling fines and fees and animal welfare, but there was this case in 2018 in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and the headline read, "Call to court over dog license, what would your town do?" And it was about this woman who had ovarian cancer, arrested because she had, it was a failure to appear due to a citation because her dog hadn't been licensed. So within our work, at least from what I've experienced, I've gotten a lot of calls that have been about these like slippery slopes that sort of like bring people into the system. I kind of want to shift gears and ask another question about it sounds like you've had some preliminary data around racial disparities, and I wanted to kind of give you an opportunity to share some of that with us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. This will be coming out. I haven't published it yet, but I'm happy to share. So all of this is preliminary, but it's really quite revealing, and I would love to hear your all thoughts on it, and if it's surprising or if it's what you've experienced in your work. But so I have sort of three sources of data that I'll quickly cover, and just very quickly for now, we can talk more and questions and answer that suggest that this isn't unique. And the reason I say unique is that when I'm talking to the animal lawyers who are driving many of these policies, these pro tough on crime policies, they often say things like, well, we just don't have any evidence that there's racial disparities in this part of the system. It's as though the subset of animal law prosecutions would be different judges, different prosecutors, different actors, and there wouldn't be the racially disparate impact. But of course, it's the same system. It's the same criminal system, and so we shouldn't be surprised. And Gabrielle nicely called it old logics. I would call them utopian logics, right? Utopian logics. We think of prison abolition as utopian, but it's quite utopian to imagine that we are reducing animal crimes through this punishment system. But here's what I found. So the first source of data is a survey of 500 people, original survey that I conducted. And what we were able to learn through this, and there's lots of complicated regressions that went into it, but what we were able to learn is that persons who are not white are about twice as likely to know someone in their community who has been accused of an animal crime, abuse or neglect, about twice as likely. And interestingly, right, this is a sort of parenthetical, those same people are about twice as likely to think that the criminal system is not doing a good job of protecting animals, whereas white persons are half as likely to know someone and twice as likely to think it's doing a good job. The second source of data that I haven't talked to anyone about yet is the FBI data. So as many of you probably realize, starting in 2016, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, big source of criminology data, started tracking animal cruelty. And very interesting things are coming to light there. It's always difficult to do population-based data to draw lots of conclusions, but I'll tell you some of the things we're seeing. So according to the census from 2016, they have sort of roving averages. 2016 to 2019, the population was of African Americans and persons who identify as Black in the United States was about 12.7%. You can give or take, but that's about what the census says it was. But when you look at animal crimes, about 22% to 30% of the animal crimes are associated with persons who are identifying as Black. So what we see is that somewhere between 2 and 3 times, Blacks are about 2 to 3 times overrepresented in the population of persons charged with animal crimes. You may say, well, is that a lot? Is that a little? It's hard to control for these things. But what I'll tell you is, Gabrielle mentioned the new Jim Crow. Well, drug crimes, as we all know, have been called the new Jim Crow, and animal lawyers are quick to say, well, this isn't like the war on drugs. We know that was racist, right? Like, we have this sort of history where we say, well, the war on drugs was racist, but this isn't racist at all. If you look at the types of offenses that are traditionally viewed as, I don't know if traditional is the right word, but are more conventionally viewed as having racial overtones. Think about things like bad check passing, George Floyd's charge, right? Vagrancy, things like drug crimes. All of those offenses, according to the FBI data, have rates of arrest for Black offenders between 18 and 26%, right? So that is to say, Black persons make up 18 to 26% of the offenders in all of those crimes I just mentioned, things like vagrancy, drug crimes, and the like. So animal crimes actually fit right in there. Right? They are not aberrational. They are not wildly different. They are right in the heartland of these crimes, things like passing a bad check that we have called the new Jim Crow. Animal crimes fit very comfortably in that. And the last thing that I have done, and I'll be happy to share with the folks at Maddie's Fund the visuals when I finalize them, but I've been spending, even just in the last week, a lot of time with phone call data. You can do amazing things. New York City, I encourage all of you who are in public entities to make your data as publicly available as possible, or to team up with Gabrielle and I to do some work on it. But New York City makes all of its phone call data to the police, 311 calls and the others, publicly available. You just have to have some computer power to upload them. And so between 2010 and 2019, I had all of the animal abuse and neglect calls to New York City. And those calls are actually mapped in the publicly available data by GPS coordinates. So you can do some pretty fascinating things. And I'll just tell you a couple of things that I've found. First, the calls are about twice as likely in the areas that are primarily non-white. For example, there are about 8 calls per 100 pets in areas that are 95% non-white, and about half as many calls, that is about 4 calls in the areas that are majority white. Also interesting from the phone call data, the areas with the highest unemployment, highest rates of public assistance, and other markers of social disadvantage saw about 2 times the rates of calls for animal abuse and neglect, right? So what this tells me is that there is absolutely a link, right? There is a link. We're always talking about the link, but the link is not that people who hurt animals are going to go hurt humans. The link is between poverty, between social inequality, between social disadvantage and animal maltreatment, right? There is more crime in general in the areas that track on these phone call data with where there's social disadvantage. And so we shouldn't be particularly surprised that there also happens to be more animal crimes in these areas. So it's really striking. There's other things that I could go through. For example, in Connecticut, there is, I was just looking at that this morning, racial disparities of up to 300% after Desmond's Law in 2019 data, but lots of things. So it's trickling in and we're just starting to see it. But I don't think there's any reason to assume that racial disparities in the enforcement of animal crimes is somehow a tiny blip and it doesn't really exist, and that it's really quite different than all other crimes.
A couple things come up for me as you're talking, but the first thing I want to stop and talk about or ask is from Carly. There's a question. It says, Richard Ryder said in the 70s that he was worried that the social justice movement was going to miss out on animals. It seems like it largely has. How can we have conversations and bring these ideas into the general public and population without being laughed out of the room? It seems like whenever this conversation comes up, it's very hard to get people to take you seriously. As in, I find it that many people find it laughable to compare human suffering to animal suffering. How can we work to change this mindset?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
Big
mean, it's
one.
super hard. I'm interested in what you think about that, Gabrielle. I mean, I will say, it's an apt question. I'm not sure that I have the answers to that. It's kind of a big picture question, but I will say that, to many of the folks in the animal protection movement, we have assumed that by saying, like, look, we've had a major victory last month. We had a new felony law in Iowa or in Florida or wherever. That is how we can symbolize it to our peers that aren't taking us seriously. Say, like, no, my dog is not like a couch. I go to jail if I start my dog on fire, right? But I think there's better ways to communicate this, right? And people have different theories about this and how we overcome the cognitive biases that cause people to not care about the suffering of non-human animals. But I will say, and I saw this just pop up in the chat too, for me, right, comparisons are always interesting. I'm not somebody who thinks that comparisons are inherently off of the table, but they're delicate, right? The dreaded comparison, as we've called it. They're delicate, and it might make more sense in many cases to compare rather than, to sort of juxtapose and recognize that there is suffering and oppression across the species barrier, rather than to just say, look, as happened in the past with women's suffrage or women's equality, or as happened in the past with slavery. Those are very difficult conversations, right? And even when I'm talking about prisons, I don't say, just like kids, just like kids locked up, animals are locked up, and equate the cages, right? It's overly simple to erase the differences. There are important differences between prisons and animal labs, and between racism and some of the animal apathy that we experience. But then there are overlaps, right? And brilliant scholars like Afko and Claire Kim have taught us that understanding oppression is a question both of Blackness and animality. These are linked questions. So it's a really important question, but I'm afraid I don't have the answer to how to change the public narrative.
Thank you. One of the things I also wanted to offer up was I noticed as I had some sort of maybe preconceived notions prior to coming into animal welfare. I think that a lot of that had to do with national rhetoric and discourse around, there's been sort of this pitting against racial justice and animal welfare. There's been this like competing conversation. And the way I have viewed it is actually there's nothing about it that's competing. And in actuality, they're interconnected. And I think there's a lot of different ways to maybe answer this question that are maybe non-conclusive, but I think that part of what animal welfare needs to do is to work towards maybe decentering the way they think of animal welfare and thinking of it from a different perspective. So part of this is building of relationships across barriers or lines that we've never considered. And then the other piece, and I think this is something that Maddie's is working towards, is this idea of centering people who have been most directly impacted into the conversation. So for example, me as a person of color showing up in the space, the noticings that I have are going to be completely different than a person that is white. And for example, I would say, as a former employee of HSUS, sometimes it feels as if we are pushing to have, so you have different layers. So you have animal protection, animal welfare, animal rights, which they're all they've got their own levels and different philosophies. But it seemed to me as if we were trying to elevate the status of animals to that of white men. And it becomes sort of intrinsically complicated because Black women don't have the same privileges as white men. So I think there's a lot of unpacking to do there. And I think that the first step is to recognize that maybe we don't know what's best. Maybe we need to sit back and do some listening to learn from outside sectors.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a valuable point. I think that it's often overlooked that we could do a lot by conversations just like that, which is why I was excited to come with Maddie's Fund. Having some conversations and just hearing some different perspectives is a lot of where my growth comes from, and this idea that Gabrielle is talking about of the connection between anti-Blackness and how that intersects with animal mistreatment, I think is one of these questions that the movement has ignored for a long time, as well as the possibility that we alienate true social justice warriors when we invest in things like saying parole is a mistake or a 108-year sentence is justice that is due. This is not going to resonate with marginalized communities, right? This is not a tactic that is going to bring the animal protection movement sort of cohesion across social justice spheres.
I wanted to ask a follow-up from the last call you had. So you made mention of there are very different realities of how Black Americans in particular view the system. For example, really like the childhood welfare, I think is a good example. Historically, child protective services in communities of color have produced this large amount of anxiety and fear. And also it's caused a lot of fear in poor white communities as well. So due to like this forced removal of children, and there's research coming out now that suggests children, and I'm bringing this out of West Virginia, where there's this massive opioid epidemic. But the research is suggesting that children are better off in the long-term care of even when that parent is experiencing substance use disorder. So there's this real rational reason why folks may like inherently have fear for the system, or even the history of social work. There's this sort of new emerging conversation within animal welfare that is pushing for mandatory reporting of animal cruelty. And I think that this has actually been passed or has been talked about in Canada. And I would say from a privileged perspective, like one might be like, hey, this is a great idea. We're going to like save all the animals. But I would say also the intention of this idea is race neutral. But in reality, I think it's important for us to acknowledge the disproportionate application of these laws. Can you speak more to like some of the history or things that you've learned about throughout your research that kind of it suggests that it gives kind of more credibility as to why people feel fearful of these sort of mandatory laws and mandatory minimums?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, briefly, I mean, the example you gave is one of the profound ones, right? I mean, there are these ideas. I mean, we often think when we think of the word carceral, and we think of prisons, we think of, but yeah, scholars like Dorothy Roberts have said that state power exercised through things like the Child Protective Services programs, even the way that we dole out civil services through, convictions and through prosecutions. That these services, I mean, she's noted that the court system has become, convictions become the ticket to certain civil services that you need. I saw somebody put in the chat, which is brilliant, right? Education. You get education and you get potentially help with vet bills and counseling. If you get a conviction, we sort of condition it rather than on need, rather than looking at the New York. If we were to pull up the map, or I have this map of New York City that I was just talking about. If we look at what sociologists call concentrated disadvantage, which measures things like how many people are on public assistance, how many people are below the poverty line, and so on and so forth. If we were to do that and do targeted interventions to help animals in that area, it would be amazing for the families. It'd be amazing for the pets. But instead we say, well, once those people get into the system, maybe we should, at best, give them services then, right? And it's very strange that welfare comes not based on need, but based on interventions with the system. But yeah, I mean, to speak more to the two examples you gave very quickly, I think that mandatory reporting, and I think that possession bans are another one that comes up a lot. They seem like really common sense solutions. And, to be fair, and you may disagree with me on this, Gabrielle, I think they are much better than calling for mandatory minimums. Having said that, right, they have highly punitive implications and negative externalities for animals and their communities. How so? Well, mandatory reporting, I have personally experienced the blowback of that, right? It means that all the vets have to report. We have to, and it's good in the sense that we want animal abuse not to be ignored. None of us want this to be the sort of thing where we say, oh, how do we make sure people take it seriously, right? We want it to be taken seriously. Does mandatory reporting to the police do it? In the same way that mandatory reporting of passing a bad check would be helpful. Maybe not, right? It may not be what we need. And in fact, we see in domestic violence and even in some child abuse realms, reporting of the harm may go down if you know that your partner who's engaged in the problem or your child is going to have to lose their pet or they're going to go to jail or something like that. So there's really hard questions here, right? And I think thinking about these things as discretionary rather than mandatory is helpful, right? We don't want animal crimes to be ignored, but to pretend that these programs will have race neutral effects is really a form of willful blindness, right? I mean, it's willfully blind for the movement to have been saying for years that there's no likelihood that these crimes are disparately affecting communities of color. I think we're increasingly able to say that's not true. Now there's this idea of like, well, as long as everyone's reporting, as long as this, we have to have sort of more holistic, or what we said earlier, wraparound solutions to this stuff.
I just wanted to mention one point from a racial justice perspective on diversion programs. Going back to the drug court or like opioid epidemic, one of the problems has been the discretionary decision, who decides who goes to drug court, who decides who gets humane education. And then the preliminary research that I have had or done out of West Virginia, it shows that there is a racial bias as to what the judge decides on who gets that diversion. So I want to just flag that to have some recognition around the racial breakdown of who actually is receiving diversion. And then there's another question in the chat. We've got about 6 minutes. So this is from Kim Wolf. It says, question for Justin. How can we reverse the trend of humane groups taking shelter dogs and giving them to police departments to use as narcotic detection dogs? We know the problems with the war on drugs, and it's a soliloquy. I think that's what that says.
That's good.
Okay. And then it says, how can we also show that arresting people for drugs, even if they're not convicted, makes it nearly impossible to find housing, employment, etc.? That's a loaded question right there too.
Yeah, I mean, sorry, I think I even missed the second part of that. I was hung up on that first part. The first part is such a brilliant point. I would love to hear more about that. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't know of that program, and it really is it's a fascinating. It's a soliloquy. I think that it's kind of one of these microcosms of what's going on, right? I mean, we imagine that the sort of relationships between race and animals are such separate spheres, and then we have dogs being trained, in the post-Civil War years. It was there's a whole series. Harper's Magazine did a whole series on the fact that the best animal fighters were whites because persons who were black just couldn't train a dog well to fight. There's this whole literature. And then when dogfighting became more associated with black men, it became a federal felony, and it became a crime in every state. We don't have to approve of dogfighting. Understand that there's a racist story underlying it, and the same is true here with this idea of imagining a world in which race and drugs and dogs were not overlapping is really hard to do. So yeah, I take your point, and I don't know the solution to that. Although I think, this is the moment to advocate for. We're seeing across campuses and across the country divestment efforts. I don't know the alternatives, right? If this dog is going to be euthanized and but I think, divesting from drug canine programs is a good way to go.
This is from Nicoletta. It says, if there are more reports of animal abuse in non-white neighborhoods, I guess the assumption is those reports are coming from abusers' non-white neighbors. These neighborhoods are therefore not being targeted by law enforcement, but rather the abusers are being identified and reported by offended neighbors. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot there. There's a lot we could say, and I'd be happy to talk about it. We don't know who the reporters are always. What we know is statistics of neighborhoods that are largely non-white, based on census tract. But more significantly, I guess what I would say is a couple of things. You tend to see, and this came up in the context of looking at enforcement of breed-specific laws, pit bull bans, and like the highest incidence, if you can get very granular, the highest incidence of reporting actually happens on the border areas. And you can see this in some of the maps too, where you have areas that are starting to gentrify, or you see neighborhoods where they're pushing up against. Those are often the highest tension areas. But secondarily, it really, to me, I mean, I take your point, right? You would say, well, if in the heart, in the central island of an area in New York City, and there are such areas, which is, I think the highest is like, it's basically all non-white in one census tract, or it was like, that. So you have only persons of color, and you're right in the middle of that. Doesn't that mean that the communities of color, these marginalized communities, they want this? Well, the point is we've never explained options, right? We don't know what's happening in those communities. Like when you see somebody hurting a dog, what do you do other than call the police? What are other alternatives? And I guess the point here is not that I'm not making a point that this is somehow okay. That it's police officers or animal control officers are out on the street and they only enforce against communities of color. We don't know that. We don't have any data to suggest that. What we know is that the system, the criminal system, when it comes to drugs, when it comes to vagrancy, when it comes to all these things, there is more reporting in communities of color. So that could mean that persons of color are reporting on their neighbors more. It could mean that people are driving through. It could mean that people are on the bus. All of those things are happening. But what it means, ultimately, at the end of the day, is that persons of color are dramatically overrepresented at 2 or 3 times the rate of their white neighbors, one census tract over, in being reported. Now, there's lots more we could say, right? When you live in a housing project or a low-income house, your business is much more available to be seen from the street or from your neighbors. It's not true in the large white neighborhoods with predominantly white neighborhoods with big fences and rocked off back walls. There's lots that can be said there, but the point is a more granular one, right? You are not wrong that when we look at these numbers, we could say, well, if communities of color are reporting it more, what should we do about that, right? If there is more crime in a Black neighborhood, doesn't that mean we should be happy to enforce more crime in the Black neighborhood? And that is exactly the theory of broken windows policing, right? That if we police the communities more forcefully, we will eradicate crime in those areas. And I can just tell you, right? I mean, reasonable minds can disagree about this, but that does contribute to disparate minority contact with the criminal system. I mean, it does, but that doesn't mean that you are wrong to say, well, look, something must be going on in those communities. It's absolutely right. And that's why I say, I think that the key point here is to understand that the real link is a link between social disorganization, a link between poverty, a link between the needs for public assistance and where we're going to find frequent abuse and neglect. It doesn't mean the abuse and neglect is not there. It means there may be some other causes and some other explanations.
Thank you, Justin. And the one point I wanted to add to that is it kind of also elevates the reason why it's so important that more people of color are involved in the solutions of how to solve these issues, because we know best about our own communities. So I just want to end it there. And I want to thank everybody for coming and sharing their time with us. I think it's really important that we engage in these difficult discussions. And if you have questions and if you want to talk further, we'll be monitoring the Maddie's Pet Forum, I think for the next week or so. And if you have follow-up questions, please just feel free to drop those into the forum. And until next time, thank you for watching.
Yeah, thanks. And I will definitely be there. I'm excited. So feel free and email me as well, but I will be in the Maddie's forum now. We'll see you soon. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.